Yellowstone National Park is best known for its geysers and bison. But it almost lost more than just its wolves when they were wiped out in the 1930s. More than 40 years later, park officials wanted to bring them back, hoping that by targeting the top of the food chain, they could reverse decades of ecological decline. But there was a problem. Since the 1920s, most of the streams in Yellowstone had run dry. And even where water did trickle down the valleys, there were no beavers left to build dams and create ponds. Without beavers, the streams couldn't be restored, even if the wolves returned. So first, the park needed to address the water crisis, which required some creative thinking. In the early 20th century, beavers were close to disappearing across the United States after decades of trapping and habitat loss. And Yellowstone was no exception. By the 1930s, every beaver in the park had been killed off. So when the park opened just a few decades earlier, beavers were an abundant species. That's why today's experiment began with none. It's hard to understand just how important beavers are to the health of a stream system. If you've ever seen what a beaver can do to a stream in a matter of months, you know that their impact is immediate. They will eat through small trees and shrubs. It's cutting them down and transporting the debris to a pond or stream where they build dams, lodges, and banks that slow the flow of water. This creates deep pools, shallow riffles, and backwater areas full of downed wood, all of which provide food, cover, and habitat for lots of other animals. Beavers are often called ecosystem engineers because as they modify the landscape, they create habitats for themselves and countless other creatures. But before we get into the details of this massive restoration project, let's zoom out and see Yellowstone as a whole. The park encompasses more than 2.2 million acres across 3 different states and protects half of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, which also includes federal lands outside the park managed by the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. This ecosystem is home to more than 6,000 species of plants and animals, including grizzly bears, cutthroat trout, and bison, of course, gray wolves. Wolves are apex predators, sitting at the very top of the food chain. Their presence influences the behaviors of every other animal they share an ecosystem with. Because they're so important, their absence ripples down to affect everything below them. Before they were eliminated, wolves kept the numbers of elk in check. But without wolves, the elk population exploded, and they started grazing in new areas. Elk are browsers, meaning they prefer to eat shrubs and other vegetation instead of grasses like most other large herbivores. By the late 1950s, there were between 10 and 20,000 elk roaming around Yellowstone. Today, there are over 20,000. In fact, according to one survey, there were about 36 elk per square mile in the northern range of the park, which is unprecedented. There are simply too many elk in Yellowstone, and they're eating more than they should. Today, these overgrazed areas look like deserts. While elk are supposed to help create openings in the understory of the forests, which benefits songbirds, they have essentially stripped entire valleys of vegetation. For example, in the Hayden Valley, there used to be shrubs that provided critical habitat for birds like the flammulated owl. Today, it's a barren moonscape. Overgrazing also increases erosion, which causes sediment to run into rivers and streams. Clear water is essential for the survival of most aquatic insects, which in turn provide food for fish like the Yellowstone cutthroat trout. But all of this overgrazing has created a perfect storm that's resulted in extremely low aquatic biodiversity. Only 11% of the stream miles surveyed in Yellowstone contain the macroinvertebrates that indicate healthy streams. So restoring the streams and the elk habitat seem like separate issues, but they're actually related. To solve both problems, scientists propose bringing back the missing pieces of Yellowstone's food chain, starting with beavers. Then they would reintroduce wolves. Once those 2 pieces were back in place, Yellowstone's stream systems and elk habitat would theoretically return to normal. Of course, theory is one thing, but it isn't always easy to put plans into action, especially when it comes to ecosystems. Even today, a lot of people think of reintroducing wolves to Yellowstone as a major mistake. They feared that wolves would attack humans and livestock, cause damage to private property, and negatively affect the local economy. Even though not everyone agreed with the plan, biologists were able to secure funding from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to start the largest ungulate restoration project in U.S. history between 1987 and 1990. The government relocated 437 beavers from Canada to Yellowstone, which sounds great, except it wasn't really. When biologists arrived to release the beavers, they found that none of the animals in the crates were alive. Somehow, despite being carefully selected and monitored by scientists, every single beaver had drowned during transport. It seems like a pretty huge setback, and it was. But luckily, there was a solution. A rancher named Howard Tanner heard about the failed project and offered to donate some of his beavers from a fur farm. With this second chance, biologists bred the animals on Tanner's farm until they had enough to begin releasing into Yellowstone. Altogether, they introduced 86 beavers over the next 2 years. When they arrived, the animals were outfitted with radio collars, so biologists could track their movements and determine whether they were building dams. The answer was yes, but not as fast as they had hoped. It took 2 years for the first beaver colony to become established and produce offspring. After another 5 years, there were only 2 colonies with a total of 26 members. Things weren't looking good, but then something unexpected happened. By 2001, 9 active colonies existed across the park with a total of more than 200 individuals. Biologists were excited, but they knew it would take years to see any real change in the stream systems. In the meantime, the park wanted to speed up the process by mimicking what beavers would naturally do. Between 1994 and 2000, crews spent $1.3 million restoring 7 stream miles by hand, planting native vegetation, and placing logs in the water. But this kind of work is expensive and time-consuming. And anyway, it wouldn't be a lasting solution because it didn't address the root of the problem, namely the lack of beavers in the watershed. Since they couldn't wait for beavers to do the job, the park decided to try to restore stream systems by hand. This seemed like a viable option, but it ended up costing more than $18,000 per mile and only produced short-term results. As it turns out, the beavers were moving faster than anyone expected. By 2003, there were 689 beavers in Yellowstone, and the number of stream miles with aquatic invertebrates had increased by 113%. But despite this success, the story doesn't end here. Beaver dams aren't just good for beavers, they're also good for elk. By creating ponds and slowing the flow of water, beavers created ideal elk habitat. But this wasn't the result scientists had anticipated. They had hoped that elk would move back into the higher elevations where there are fewer predators. But instead, elk began congregating around the beaver ponds. As it turns out, there were more resources available around the beaver ponds than in the higher elevations. So instead of reducing the elk population, the beavers inadvertently provided them with even more habitat. This meant that if Yellowstone wanted to restore the elk habitat they had envisioned, they would need to continue managing the elk population by relocating animals to other areas. But once again, there were unintended consequences. When elk were removed from overgrazed areas, shrubby vegetation quickly returned, and with it, the flammulated owls that depended on them. But this also meant that when elk were moved to less suitable habitat, they ate all of the vegetation there and sometimes starved. So scientists tried other methods like contraception to keep elk numbers down, but that proved to be controversial. The public felt like the park was deliberately trying to kill the elk and demanded that it stop. To make matters worse, despite the return of beavers and elk, wolf reintroduction wasn't enough to restore the stream systems. From 1995 to 2000, the park introduced 40 wolves, and by 2015, there were more than 100. But that wasn't enough to keep the elk population under control. This wasn't surprising, since studies had shown that wolves reduce elk numbers by only about 1% per year. That means it would take decades to reduce the elk population by 20%. And in the meantime, the elk would continue to eat away at the vegetation and degrade the streams. So what did Yellowstone do? Well, biologists knew that while wolves were taking a small bite out of the elk population each year, beavers were having an even bigger impact. So they began to focus on beaver restoration efforts. Unfortunately, the results were disappointing. By 2015, while the number of beaver colonies had grown to 20, the number of beavers in the park had decreased. Today, Yellowstone officials call the situation a partial victory. While beaver numbers are lower than they would like, they are still better than the 0 the park started with. And thanks to the beaver, water levels have stabilized and fish are returning to the streams. But it hasn't been an easy road, and it's far from over. In order to fully restore the streams of Yellowstone, officials will need to find a way to increase the number of beavers in the park. But there's still a long way to go. Yellowstone is a complex ecosystem with multiple large predators and ecosystem engineers working together. It's a balancing act that's taken tens of thousands of years to get right. And it will take more time, collaboration, and funding to finish the job. Restoring an ecosystem is a slow process, and it's not always clear what the impacts will be. But it seems that so far at least the gamble has paid off. Elk habitat has improved, fish are returning to the streams, and more species are thriving than ever before. Thanks for watching.